When helicopter alarm sounds passed over the farm, everyone looked up. There was a medical emergency. An ambulance helicopter was coming for their elderly neighbor who'd suffered a heart attack. But weather conditions were terrible. Wind was fierce, visibility minimal. The pilot radioed, "I can't land, too risky." That's when the quiet woman they knew as a farm worker stepped forward and said 3 words that changed everything. "I can land it." Before we continue this incredible story, tell us in the comments, from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the quiet heroes who walk among us. The morning mist still clung to the rolling hills of Riverside County when Maria Santos arrived at Henderson Farm for her usual 6 a.m. shift. Her weathered pickup truck, a 15-year-old Ford with more rust than paint, pulled into the gravel parking area next to the equipment barn. She moved with quiet efficiency, gathering her work gloves and water bottle, nodding politely to the other workers who were already preparing for the day. Maria had been working at Henderson Farm for 3 years, ever since moving to this rural California valley after her husband's death. She was what the locals called reliable help, showed up on time, worked hard, never caused drama. At 42, she was older than most seasonal workers, but she had a steady hand with delicate crops and didn't mind the long hours under the sun. The other workers knew little about her past. She'd mentioned once that she was from San Diego, that her husband had been military, and that she preferred the quiet of farm work to city life. Beyond that, Maria Santos remained a mystery wrapped in flannel shirts and work boots. Tom Henderson, the farm owner, valued her consistency. She worked primarily in the greenhouse operation and the more technical aspects of crop management, areas that required precision and attention to detail. While the younger guys operated the heavy machinery and handled the physical labor, Maria focused on the specialized work that kept the operation running smoothly. "Morning, Maria," called out Jake Rodriguez, one of the tractor operators, as she walked past. "Supposed to hit 95 degrees today. You sure you don't want to work in the air-conditioned packing house instead?" Maria smiled politely. "I'm fine in the fields, Jake. Thanks, though." The men often made gentle suggestions about her working in easier conditions, though Maria had never complained about the heat, the hours, or the physical demands of farm work. She had a quiet toughness that they respected, even if they didn't understand it. What none of them knew was that Maria Santos had spent 12 years as Captain Maria Santos, U.S. Army, flying AH-64 Apache helicopters in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. Iraq, Afghanistan, training exercises in extreme weather. She'd logged over 2,000 flight hours in military rotorcraft before a policy change had ended her flying career earlier than she'd planned. That morning started like any other. Maria was in Greenhouse 3, monitoring the hydroponic tomato systems when the first emergency sirens echoed across the valley. At 9:15 a.m., the distant wail of ambulance sirens carried on the morning air, followed by the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors. Old Pete Milligan, who lived in the farmhouse just over the ridge, had suffered a massive heart attack while feeding his cattle. His wife Betty had called 911, but the nearest hospital with cardiac facilities was 45 minutes away by road, too long for Pete's condition. The only option was emergency medical helicopter transport. Maria looked up from her work as the sound of rotors grew louder. Through the greenhouse windows, she could see other workers stepping out to watch the medical helicopter approach. It was a typical emergency medical services bird, a Bell 429 painted in bright yellow and red, equipped for critical patient transport. But as the aircraft approached the designated landing zone in Milligan's pasture, Maria could see immediately that something was wrong. The helicopter was fighting severe crosswinds, and the pilot was having difficulty maintaining stable flight. Weather conditions had deteriorated since dawn. What had started as a calm morning had turned into gusting winds of 30 to 40 miles per hour. Maria stepped outside and shielded her eyes, watching the pilot's attempts to set down safely. She could read the aircraft's behavior like a book, the way it yawed in the wind, the pilot's overcorrections, the unstable hover as he tried to find a moment of calm air. Other farm workers had gathered now, along with Tom Henderson and several neighbors who'd heard about Pete's emergency. Everyone watched anxiously as the helicopter struggled against the wind. The pilot's voice crackled over emergency radio frequencies that Maria knew by heart. "Ground control, this is Med Flight 7. Wind conditions are beyond safe landing parameters. Gusts are hitting 40-plus knots with severe turbulence. I cannot safely set down at this location." Betty Milligan's voice came back, strained with desperation. "Please, he's dying. Isn't there anything you can do?" "Ma'am, I understand the urgency, but I cannot risk the aircraft and crew. We need to find an alternate plan." From where she stood, Maria could see the pilot's dilemma clearly. The designated landing zone was in a natural wind tunnel between two hills, creating turbulence that would challenge even an experienced pilot. But Maria also knew something the pilot didn't. There was a better approach angle that would use the terrain to minimize wind effect. Tom Henderson was talking rapidly on his cell phone with emergency services, trying to coordinate alternative solutions. Jake and the other workers stood helplessly, watching the helicopter circle overhead, unable to land. That's when Maria stepped forward. "Tom," she said quietly, approaching the farm owner. "I might be able to help." Henderson looked at her with confusion. "Maria, this isn't really a situation where—" "I can talk that pilot through a safe landing approach," she interrupted, her voice calm but authoritative. "I know this terrain, and I know helicopters." The men around her exchanged glances. Jake laughed nervously. "Maria, no offense, but this is serious stuff. That pilot's trained for—" "I know what the pilot's trained for," Maria said, her tone shifting to something none of them had heard before. "And I know he's about to abort this mission because he doesn't see the safe approach vector." Tom Henderson studied her face. In 3 years of employment, he'd never seen this side of Maria Santos. There was something in her eyes, confidence, knowledge, authority, that made him pause. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked. Maria looked up at the circling helicopter, calculating wind patterns and approach angles with the automatic precision of someone who'd done it thousands of times. "I'm saying I can guide him in safely. But I need to use the emergency radio frequency, and I need everyone to stay clear of the alternate landing zone." "How do you know about emergency radio frequencies?" Henderson asked suspiciously. Maria met his eyes directly for the first time since he'd known her. "Because I spent 12 years flying helicopters for the U.S. Army." The silence that followed was profound. Jake's mouth fell open. Tom Henderson blinked hard, as if trying to process information that didn't fit his understanding of the quiet farm worker he'd employed for 3 years. "You're a pilot?" Henderson asked. "I was, a H-64 Apache, retired captain, U.S. Army." The men around her were staring now, trying to reconcile this revelation with the woman they'd known as a greenhouse worker who preferred to work alone and rarely spoke above a whisper. Above them, the medical helicopter was burning fuel in a holding pattern, and Pete Milligan was dying. "Tom," Maria said urgently, "we don't have time for explanations. That man needs to get to a hospital, and I can make it happen. But I need your trust, and I need it now." Henderson looked at the helicopter, then back at Maria. In the distance, they could see Betty Milligan standing in her yard, watching the sky with desperate hope. "What do you need?" he asked. Maria was already moving toward Henderson's pickup truck. "Your truck radio, and everyone needs to move away from the east pasture. That's where he's coming down." As she climbed into the truck and reached for the CB radio, Jake called out, "Maria, are you sure about this?" She paused before keying the microphone. "Jake, in 12 years of military flying, I never lost a crew member or failed a mission because I wasn't sure about something." The authority in her voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't the quiet farm worker they'd known. This was someone else entirely. Maria tuned the CB to the emergency frequency she knew the medical helicopter would be monitoring. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm precision of someone accustomed to life-and-death communications. "Med Flight 7, this is ground support. I have traffic advisory and alternate landing approach information if you're willing to accept guidance from a qualified pilot." There was a pause before the helicopter pilot responded. "Ground support. This is Med Flight 7. What are your qualifications?" 12 years military rotorcraft, over 2,000 hours, AH-64 Apache, familiar with local terrain and wind patterns. Another pause, longer this time. "Ground support, I'm listening." Maria climbed out of the truck and positioned herself where she could see both the helicopter's position and the terrain features she needed to reference. "Med Flight 7, your current approach vector puts you directly in a wind shear zone created by the ridge topology. I'm going to guide you to an approach from the southeast that will give you cleaner air and a more stable descent profile." Copy ground support. I'm willing to try your approach. What happened next was a masterclass in precision aviation communication. Maria began guiding the pilot through a complex approach that used the natural terrain features to create a wind shadow, a pocket of calmer air where the helicopter could safely descend. Flight 7. Turn to heading 140 degrees, descend to 400 feet above ground level. Turning to 140, descending to 400 AGL. The farm workers watched in amazement as the helicopter, which had been struggling violently against the wind moments before, suddenly began flying with smooth, controlled movements. Good, Flight 7. You're now in the lee of the northern ridge. Continue descent to 200 feet and adjust heading to 160 degrees. You should feel the wind conditions improve. Incredible, the pilot's voice came back. Wind dropped from 35 knots to less than 10. How did you know? Experience, Maria replied simply. Continue on 160 and prepare for final approach to the east pasture. You'll see a natural clearing about 50 meters east of the farmhouse. Tom Henderson had moved his truck to mark the landing zone, and the other workers had cleared the area as Maria instructed. Betty Milligan stood at a safe distance, clutching her hands together as she watched the helicopter make its approach. Flight 7, you are clear for landing. Wind is now favorable, visibility good. Emergency personnel should approach from the south to avoid rotor wash. The helicopter touched down smoothly in the pasture, its rotors kicking up dust and dried grass but maintaining perfect stability throughout the landing sequence. As the medical crew rushed toward the Milligan farmhouse with their equipment, the pilot's voice came over the radio one more time. Ground support. That was exceptional flying guidance. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen terrain reading like that from someone on the ground. What did you say your name was? Maria looked at the men standing around her. Tom Henderson, Jake, the other farm workers, all staring at her with expressions of amazement and newfound respect. Captain Maria Santos, U.S. Army, retired, she said into the radio. Glad we could help. 20 minutes later, Pete Milligan was loaded into the helicopter and on his way to the regional medical center where emergency surgery would save his life. The pilot executed a perfect takeoff using the same approach vector Maria had guided him through, and the aircraft disappeared into the morning sky. As the sound of rotors faded, an unusual silence settled over the farm. The crisis was over, but everything had changed. The quiet woman they'd worked alongside for 3 years had revealed herself to be someone entirely different. Jake was the first to speak. Captain, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Maria replied, her voice returning to its usual quiet tone. Pete's going to be okay, and that's what matters. But Tom Henderson wasn't ready to let the moment pass. Maria, 12 years flying Apaches, combat missions? She nodded. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. Flew support missions for ground troops, medical evacuations, reconnaissance. Why didn't you ever tell us? Maria looked out across the farm where she'd spent 3 years doing work that had nothing to do with her military training or aviation expertise. Because that part of my life was over, she said simply. When my husband died, when the Army changed its policies about female combat pilots, I needed something different, something quiet. The men around her were processing this information, trying to understand how someone with her background had ended up working in their greenhouses and vegetable fields. But you could be flying commercially, Jake said. Airlines, charter services, emergency medical like that pilot. Why work on a farm? Maria smiled for the first time that morning, not the polite, distant smile they were used to, but something warmer and more genuine. Jake, do you know what the best part of flying was for me? He shook his head. It wasn't the adrenaline or the advanced technology or even the missions. It was the quiet moments between flights, when everything was peaceful, and you could just appreciate being alive. She gestured toward the fields around them. This farm gives me that feeling every day. No life or death decisions, no split-second timing, no one shooting at me, just the satisfaction of growing things, of working with my hands, of being part of something that feeds people. Tom Henderson was still staring at her with amazement. Maria, I feel like I've been completely blind for 3 years. Here I was, thinking you were just good with the greenhouse systems because you're detail-oriented. I am detail-oriented, she said with a slight laugh. You have to be when you're flying a $30 million aircraft with people's lives depending on your decisions. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. Betty Milligan was driving over from her house, followed by several neighbors who'd heard about the emergency. Betty climbed out of her car and walked directly to Maria, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know who you are," she said, "but the paramedics told me that helicopter couldn't land until someone on the ground guided them in. They said whoever did that saved Pete's life." Maria started to deflect the praise, but Betty wasn't finished. 38 years of marriage," Betty continued. "I thought I was going to lose him today. But because of you, he's going to come home." The emotional weight of the moment settled over everyone present. This wasn't just about aviation expertise or hidden military backgrounds. This was about a life saved, a family kept together, a community reminded of the extraordinary people who might be living quietly among them. Over the next hour, word spread throughout the valley about what had happened. The story took on different details as it traveled. Some versions had Maria actually flying the helicopter herself. Others described her as a former Air Force pilot rather than Army. But the core truth remained. The quiet farm worker had revealed herself to be a decorated military pilot who'd saved a neighbor's life. By afternoon, Maria found herself at the center of attention she'd spent 3 years trying to avoid. Local news crews arrived, wanting to interview the mystery pilot. The farm became a gathering point for neighbors and friends who wanted to thank her personally. But through it all, Maria remained characteristically humble and reserved. She answered questions politely but briefly, always directing attention back to Pete Milligan's recovery and the skill of the medical helicopter crew. "I just provided some local knowledge about wind patterns," she told the reporters. "The real heroes are the paramedics and the pilot who took the risk to save a man's life." As evening approached and the last of the visitors departed, Maria found herself alone with Tom Henderson, walking through the fields where she'd worked in anonymity for 3 years. "So what happens now?" Henderson asked. "I mean, after today, everyone knows who you are. Are you going to go back to flying?" Maria considered the question as they walked between rows of tomato plants she'd helped nurture from seedlings. "Tom, when I left the Army, I thought my flying days were over forever. I thought I'd never touch the controls of an aircraft again, and I was okay with that." She paused to examine a tomato plant, checking for signs of disease with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to pre-flight inspections. "But today reminded me that skills like mine aren't just about personal achievement. They're tools that can help people when they need it most." "Does that mean you're leaving the farm?" Maria smiled. "Where would I go? This is my home now. These are my people." "But?" She trailed off, looking thoughtful. But maybe I could do both. Keep working here, keep living quietly, but also be available when situations like today arise. Emergency services could use someone with my background as a consultant. Medical helicopter services, search and rescue operations." Henderson nodded. "That sounds like a perfect fit for you." As they headed back toward the farmhouse, Maria's old pickup truck came into view. Henderson noticed something he'd never seen before. A small, faded sticker on the rear window that read, "Army Aviation." "How did I miss that for 3 years?" he asked, pointing to the sticker. Maria laughed. "Because you saw what I wanted you to see. A farm worker who showed up on time and did good work. Sometimes the best way to hide something is to put it right out in the open." That evening, Maria sat on the porch of her small rental house, looking out over the valley where she'd found peace after losing everything that had once defined her identity. Her phone had been ringing all day with calls from aviation companies, news outlets, and military organizations who'd heard about the rescue. But the call that mattered most came just before sunset. It was from the hospital, letting her know that Pete Milligan had successfully undergone cardiac surgery and was expected to make a full recovery. As she hung up the phone, Maria realized that today had changed something fundamental about her relationship with her past. For 3 years, she'd been running from her identity as a pilot, treating it as a closed chapter in her life. But today had shown her that some skills, some purposes, are too important to abandon completely. The next morning, Maria arrived at Henderson Farm at her usual time, wearing her usual work clothes, ready to continue her usual duties. But when Jake and the other workers greeted her, there was a new respect in their voices, a recognition of the depth and complexity they'd never suspected. "Morning, Captain," Jake said with a grin. "Morning, Jake," she replied, "and it's just Maria. Captain was a long time ago." But as she walked toward the greenhouses to begin another day of quiet, productive work, Maria Santos carried herself with a subtle difference. She was still the same dedicated farm worker, but she was no longer hiding from who she'd been. She was integrating her past with her present, her military service with her civilian life, her extraordinary skills with her ordinary daily routine. Later that week, Maria received official recognition from the County Emergency Services Department for her role in Pete Milligan's rescue. The ceremony was small and simple, held at the local fire station with just a few dozen people in attendance. As she accepted the commendation, Maria looked out at the audience. Farm workers she'd labored beside, neighbors she'd helped in small ways over the years, and Pete and Betty Milligan, who were there to thank her personally. 3 years ago, I came to this valley looking for a quiet place to start over, she said. I thought I was leaving my old life behind completely. What I learned this week is that we don't have to choose between who we were and who we're becoming. Sometimes the best version of ourselves includes all the chapters of our story. She paused, looking at the faces of people who'd become her community. I'm proud to have served my country as a pilot, and I'm equally proud to serve this community as a farm worker. Both roles have taught me that the most important thing we can do is be ready to help when help is needed, whether that's landing a helicopter in difficult conditions or making sure the tomatoes are ready for harvest. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, reflecting the respect of people who discovered that heroism often wears work boots and drives an old pickup truck. In the months that followed, Maria continued working at Henderson Farm, but she also began volunteering with regional emergency services as a helicopter operations consultant. She helped train ground crews in landing zone preparation, advised on weather-related flight decisions, and occasionally provided guidance for challenging rescue operations. She never returned to full-time flying, but she'd found a way to honor both sides of her identity, the decorated military pilot and the quiet farm worker who'd found peace in growing things and helping her community. Pete Milligan made a full recovery and returned to his cattle farm. Every time he saw Maria around town, he'd tip his hat and say, "There goes my guardian angel." Maria would smile politely and redirect the conversation to more practical matters, but those who knew her could see the quiet satisfaction in her eyes. Because sometimes the greatest service isn't performed in uniform or with public recognition. Sometimes it's performed by ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the moment calls for it, then returning to their everyday lives without fanfare or expectation of reward. Maria Santos had learned to fly helicopters in the military, but she'd learned to be a hero in a farm field, surrounded by people who needed her skills and trusted her judgment. And that, she decided, was exactly where she belonged. So I ask you, have you ever met someone whose quiet exterior concealed remarkable capabilities? Someone who served their country or community in ways you never suspected until circumstances revealed their true nature? Share their story in the comments. Tell us how they impacted your life, how they changed your understanding of what heroism looks like. Because here at Hidden Hero Stories, we believe that the most powerful examples of service and sacrifice often happen in the shadows, performed by people who never ask for credit but always step forward when they're needed most. Subscribe to our channel, share this story, and help us celebrate the quiet heroes who walk among us every day, ready to save lives, solve problems, and remind us that extraordinary people often hide behind the most ordinary appearances. Thank you for watching, and remember, the next time you meet someone whose life seems simple and unremarkable, take a closer look. You might be standing next to someone who once flew helicopters in combat zones, or performed surgery in field hospitals, or saved lives in ways you could never imagine. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear work gloves and drive pickup trucks, waiting patiently for the moment when their unique skills can make all the difference in the world.